Hello everyone, it's Scott, and we're back for our final installment of Spoilers from Murders at Karlov Manor. We got the full set today, and we've got a lot of interesting cards to talk about. Before we do, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this in future spoiler seasons, but also we'll be doing some top 10 lists in the next couple of days, so stick around for those as well. But now let's dive into the last day of spoilers for Murders at Karlov Manor. So the first card we got today is Niv Mizzet Guild Pack for a white, a blue, a black, a red, and a green mana. We get a legendary creature that's a dragon avatar and is a 6/6. It has flying and hexproof from multicolored. Whenever Niv Mizzet Guild Pack deals combat damage to a player, it deals X damage to any target. Target player draws X cards and you gain X life, where X is the number of different color pairs among permanents you control that are exactly two colors. So very interesting card here. And we've got our ley line that turns all of our lands into all colors of mana. So I think though this card and that works really well together. And I think if you're able to attack with Niv Mizzet, the ability there is very powerful. You get to do that damage to any target, and then you're going to be able to draw cards, you're going to gain life, and it's going to put you really ahead in the game. I wish Niv Mizzet had trample. You know, that would have been the only thing that made sure that you got that damage through, but it is flying and evasive, so I think this is a card that our 5-colored decks might just want to have in it because of the powerful finishing ability. We've already got a 5-color deck in Standard, so we know the mana is there to do this. The question is this the kind of right card for Standard? And I think it's got an outside chance of being just that. Next, we've got Reenact the Crime. For 1 and 3 blue mana, you get an instant and exile target non-land card in a graveyard that was put there from anywhere this turn. Copy it. You may cast a copy without paying its mana cost. So very interesting instant here. It's kind of got that doubling season effect on it, where something goes to graveyard and you get to then cast this and make a copy of that. But I think this may find its way into a deck that is actually a dedicated mill deck, where you're kind of milling things into the graveyard, like you want to mill into the graveyard your Atraxa or some other, Titan of Industry or some other big card. And then what you're doing is casting this to bring that back. So the one downside of it is it has to be on the turn that you cast this. So it could be a very good creature on your opponent's side as well that you were able to kill and it left the battlefield. So I think this has Standard playability. The question is, what kind of deck is going to want it? And I think finding the right place for it is the biggest thing. But the ability itself is very powerful, and being able to sneak an Atraxa or something like that into play because you're able to discard it seems to me like that's a pretty powerful ability in Standard. And in other formats, I think you're going to see this as well. Definitely Commander. This is a good card for Commander. And I think it also may have some Pioneer playability. Next, we've got Hide in Plain Sight. For 3 and a green mana, you get a sorcery, and you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library and cloak 2 of them and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is an interesting card to me as well. You get to look at 5 cards, you get to cloak 2 of them, and hopefully you're cloaking creatures, and then when you've got the mana later in the game, then you can flip them for their mana cost. And I think that for 4 mana, this isn't overcosted because you're getting 2 bodies, which are 2/2s with that cloak ability on them. So I think this is playable in the right sort of deck. And again, we've already kind of got the pieces for a disguise or cloak deck out there. So I think this is a piece that was designed to go in that deck. Next, we've got Audience with Tristani. For 2 and a green mana, you get a sorcery, and you get to create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then draw cards equal to the number of differently named creature tokens you control. So we've already got a number of token decks in Standard. We've got our Boros Convoke deck that has a lot of different tokens in it. So I think this card is actually going to have standard playability, whether it's maybe in a Naya shell or you're using this and you're able to draw 3 or 4 cards with it. And I think this also has playability in other formats, certainly a commander card, because we've got a lot of commander decks that are really trying to go wide with tokens. The one restriction on it here that I want to make sure I point out is that it's differently named creature tokens you control. So if you got 5 soldier tokens, it's still the equivalent of only 1. It's not going to be 5. So it's got to have different name on it to count as a different creature. So if you can meet those requirements with a lot of different creature tokens in your deck, you play this in the mid to late game, you draw 3 or 4 cards from it, that's a pretty solid ability in green in standard. And I think because of that, it's going to see playability in standard. It's just a matter of what deck is going to be able to take advantage of it. Next, we've got World Soul's Rage for X and a red and a green mana. World Soul's Rage deals X damage to any target. Put up to X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield. So this is an interesting card for me as well, because what this could be is you put 4 mana until you do 2 damage to everything, and hopefully wipe out some of your opponent's board, or if you can play it for 5, then you're doing 3 damage to anything. But then also you get the advantage of bringing lands back from your graveyard. So I think this is going to need to be in a deck that is putting cards into the graveyard as part of the normal process of the game, whether they're milling or they're discarding things, so that way they've got lands in the graveyard. Now we also have fetch lands from New Capenna that make a lot of sense here as well. You have those in your deck and you play those, you crack them when they come into play, and then later you play World Soul Rage and you get those back and you get to go get another basic land. And we definitely have some other cards like this in standard that we've got from this set as well that are going to go find a land for you. So I think this has definite standard playability in a Gruul deck where you're really trying to make sure that you're ramping very well, but you're also able to take out small creatures that your opponent has, and you get to ramp in that process. So I like the card. I think it's going to be one that definitely is going to see some standard playability. Next, we have Illicit Masquerade for 3 and a black mana. You get an enchantment with flash. And when Illicit Masquerade enters the battlefield, put a counterfeit counter on each creature you control. Whenever a creature you control with a counterfeit counter on it dies, exile it and return up to 1 other target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So again, I think this is another card that wants to be in a self-milling deck. And I can see, we've already got a decent graveyard deck in standard right now that's in Golgari colors. So that deck, certainly I think this would be a great card in there, where you play this, when a board wipe is coming or something like that, you've already milled a bunch of cards from your library. So at that point, you flash this in, you put the Masquerade counters on your creatures, and then when they die, you just get to go pick cards out of your graveyard to replace them. So I think that's a pretty good place for this. Now, another deck I think this works pretty well in is going to be the Raffine deck. Because one of the things, obviously, we know with Raffine decks, we're constantly, moving through cards. We got to draw and discard, and we're wanting to discard things that are creatures or permanents that would go onto the battlefield, so non-land cards basically. And this works really well with that as well. So I can see a deck having a couple copies of this in it if you're playing against somebody that has board wipes in standard, so that way you can benefit from all the cards you've put in the graveyard and start bringing those back once the cards you've got on the field die. Next, we've got Improbable Explosion for 2, a blue and a red mana. You get a sorcery. First, you get to draw 2 cards, and then You may discard 2 cards. When you do, Improbable Explosion deals X damage to each creature, where X is the highest mana value among the discarded cards. So it's a 4 mana, draw 2, and then maybe discard 2. So I guess if you don't have things you want to discard, you don't have to. Or if you are in the mid to late game and you just want the card draw, you can do that as well. But also, if you need to clear the board, you can discard a high mana spell that you've got, 3 or 4 mana, and then that does 3 or 4 damage to everything. So I think there's some standard playability for this, but it's going to have to be in the right deck. And I'm not really sold on it for sure as a standard playable card. Next, we've got Anzarag's Rampage. For 3 and 2 red mana, you get a sorcery and destroy all artifacts you don't control, then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put into graveyards from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield. It gains haste, and then return it to your hand at the beginning of the end step. Again, this is a card that I think is really, from a standard standpoint, this is a sideboard card. So if you're playing against a deck that's playing a lot of artifacts, whether they're getting a lot of clue tokens or blood tokens, or even treasure tokens or explorer tokens, so we're definitely going to see all that stuff in standard right now. So I think this is a good red sideboard card because it's one way. It's all of your opponent's stuff that's going to be destroyed. None of your stuff will get destroyed. And then you get the benefit of exiling cards off the top of your deck. But outside of the sideboard, I don't think I would want this in standard because there's not going to be consistency in its usage. So because of that, it's a sideboard option at best, but I think it is standard playable. Now, where this is probably going to be an all-star is in Commander, because you're playing against 3 other players. They're going to be playing things like mana rocks, and because of that, you play this, and you're going to definitely destroy artifacts that they have, and the result of that is you're going to get to look at some cards and hopefully find a good creature from among them. It hastes in, it does its thing, and helps you out in that particular matchup. Next, we've got some lower rarity cards from the day that I want to talk about because I think they all have some relative events for standard. So first is Vengeful Tracker. For 1 and a red mana, you get a Human Detective. That's a 2/2. And whenever an opponent sacrifices an artifact, Vengeful Tracker deals 2 damage to them. So in my mind, this is a really nice card. I would definitely play this in limited because we know that there are going to be artifacts and tokens in those matchups. So definitely want to play this there. And I also think it's a sideboard option because, again, we're going to have people who are going to be playing clue tokens and blood tokens and treasure tokens and explore tokens in standard. And if you're playing it in the right matchup, this is a card that's going to do a ton of damage to your opponent because every time they do that, they're going to lose 2 life. So I really like this as a sideboard option in standard. And if we get to a place where I would be really confident that my opponent was going to be playing cards that they were going to sacrifice that were artifacts, I think it's even potentially main deckable in the right format setup for standard. We also got Coerced to Kill. For 3, a blue and a black mana. You get an enchantment, that's an aura. And you enchant creature. You control enchanted creature. Enchanted creature has base power and toughness 1/1, has death touch, and is an assassin in addition to its other types. So I look at this as a great steal spell in the mid to late game. If you're playing in a control deck, you take their best creature, you get all the benefits of it. So say you take a Sheoldred, you get all the benefits of Sheoldred for a period of time in the game where you're gaining life when you're drawing and they're losing life when they're drawing. So I think this has potential to see some standard playability in the right kind of control deck. I would definitely want this in limited because it's my way of taking out the best creature my opponent has. I keep all of its abilities and it's going to have death touch, and worst case scenario is I block with it, it kills something else on the opponent's side, and I benefit from the trade. Next, we've got a couple lower rarity black cards to talk about. And the first is Cerebral Confiscation. For 2 and a black mana, you get a sorcery, and target opponent discards 2 cards, or target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. So kind of depending, I think this is very functional for us, potentially even in standard, because we've seen 3 mana spells that just make your opponent discard 2 cards played in standard. So I think this can see some standard playability. Definitely I'd want to, if I drew this in my limited pool, I'd want to take it, because putting my opponent down 2 cards is really powerful in limited, because cards are going to be at a premium, and putting them down 2 really helps you move ahead in the game. Next, we have Unscrupulous Agent. For 1 and a black mana, you get an Elf Detective, and when Unscrupulous Agent enters the battlefield, target opponent exiles a card from their hand, and it's a 1/1. So again, another card that forces your opponent to exile stuff, and we see a lot of cards similar to this played in standard. They're black 2-drops. They force your opponent to discard a card, so you get a body and the effect of forcing a discard. Even though it's not something you get to choose, it's still pretty effective in standard and definitely in limited. Next, we've got Case File Auditor. For 2 and a white mana, you get a Human Detective. That's a 1/4, and when Case File Auditor enters the battlefield, and whenever you solve a case, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast case spells. So interesting card here. So the upside of it is you get to go through, you'd look at the top 6 cards of your library, pull an enchantment from them. So I could even see this being as part of that Selesnya enchantment deck. I know 1/4 isn't great, and to really get the benefits of Case File Auditor, you're going to have cases in your deck. But we've got some decent white and green cases that we've already talked about that I think are definitely playable, and maybe things that you would want to play in the enchantment deck, because they're low to the ground things that would help you, initiate your plan in that particular deck. So I'm interested to see if this is playable within that deck. But definitely in any kind of deck where you're building it around cases, this is a perfect card, because it's going to let you dig for cases, and you'll be able to play them consistently throughout the game that way. And again, you get to play them for any mana. Next, we've got Person of Interest. For 3 and a red mana, you get a Human Rogue. That's a 2/2, and when Person of Interest enters the battlefield, suspect it. Create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. So 4 mana for 2/2 bodies, I think, is a decent rate in limited, and certainly something that would be definitely playable there. Next, we've got a couple of dual cards here that I want to talk about. The first is Flatsum and Jetsum. Flatsum for 1 and a Simic mana, you can mill 3 and investigate, or you can play Jetsum for 4, a Dimir mana and a Dimir mana, and each opponent mills 3 cards, and you may cast a spell from each opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell cast this way will be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. So this is really one of the few 6 mana sides of the spell that I think might be playable, because you're basically going to be able to get the best thing out of your opponent's graveyard, and it's not limited, meaning that it doesn't have to be a creature. It could be anything in their graveyard. So if you did this and you need a board wipe, you can if they had a board wipe, you can pull their board wipe out. If they have an Atraxa in their graveyard, you can pull that out. So it gives you a lot of flexibility on what your choices are, and I really like that about the card. Now the question is it good enough for standard? Not sold on it yet, but it might be. Where I think it's going to do really well is in Commander, because you're going to play this on, relatively early in the game. You play it for 6 mana, and your opponents are going to mill 3 cards each, and then you get to go into all 3 graveyards and get spells out of those graveyards and cast them. So pretty powerful ability in Commander. Next, we've got Hustle and Bustle. On the Hustle side, it's a hybrid. Is it mana and target creature attacks or blocks this turn if able? So nice ability to force your opponent to use a creature in combat. On the Bustle side, it's 4 and 2 hybrid. Gruel manas and creatures you control get +2. Can I just talk? Creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. You may turn a creature you control face up. So if you're playing in a face down deck where you've got cards that are face down, you can go ahead and use this card, give everything +2/+2. They gain trample, so you're going to get damage through, and then you also get the benefit of turning a card face up without paying its mana cost. So I think this potentially has a little bit of standard playability, but again, I'm looking at mostly from the Hustle side first, and it says, is this something I would want to do? And yes, there are instances when I want to force a block, there are instances when I want to force an attack, and then late in the game, then the Bustle side looks pretty good to me, where all my creatures get trample and they get that +2, and if I am playing cards that are face down, then I get the benefit of flipping one of those as well. In our last 2 cards of Murders at Karlov Manor previous season are going to be Slice from the Shadows. For X and a black mana, you get an instant that target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. So the amount of mana you put into is going to determine how much the power and toughness is going to be reduced. But more importantly, this is a spell cannot be countered. And in Limited, I think that's a great card because your opponent really can't prevent you from, in the late game, definitely, probably killing their best creature. But even in Standard, I think this has some playability because it's a spell that can't be countered. And that is something that definitely, as you look at cards from sets, notice those cards, because things that are not counterable really do tend to have an impact on the format. Last card of our season is Fey Flight. For 1 and a blue mana, you get an enchantment that's an aura. It has flash and enchant creature. When Fey Flight enters the battlefield, enchanted creature gains hexproof until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has flying. So really we're getting kind of 2 abilities put together on the card. First is that hexproof ability. We've got cards for 2 mana or 1 mana in blue that do this. And then you get that additional ability of increasing the power of your creature by 1 and also giving it flying, which can be very important in Standard, because say your opponent targets your Sheoldred, you target your Sheoldred with Fey Flight, it's now 5/5 with hexproof on that turn, so it's not going to get killed. And then on your turn, it's going to have flying, and now is an evasive threat that your opponent has to deal with. And if they can't, Sheoldred's probably going to end the game pretty quickly. And we do have a bunch of, pretty powerful creatures that don't have flying in Standard, and I think this is going to be something that's going to make those cards potentially even more better. All right, so that's Murders at Karlov Manor spoiler season. Thanks for staying to the end of the video. I'll put up for you the last couple of preview videos we've got in case you haven't had a chance to look at those. I'll be back later in the week with some top 10 lists, top 15 lists of cards I think are going to have the most impact on Standard. So stick around for those, and I will see you in the next video.